Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to be back in Helsinki. The last time I was here, I was still with our government. I was, as I said, I was a top cyber diplomat. We had a bilat with my Finnish counterpart. In fact, we have counterparts all over the world, including in Finland. So it's nice to be back here. As was talked about, my background, particularly as a former prosecutor, I'm a recovering lawyer, and so normally when you're talking to a crowd like this, especially after lunch, you try to break the ice a little bit by telling a lawyer joke. But the problem with telling lawyer jokes, I've learned from long experience, is that lawyers don't think they're funny, and non-lawyers don't think they're jokes. So I'll dispense with that. I'm now, or I have been, my career evolved over time, and I became essentially a cyber diplomat, and I'll explain what that means. What I want to talk about today is what cyber diplomacy is. I want to talk about some of the US approaches. I want to talk about issues in terms of the threat, issues in terms of the challenges we have, also some of the things we're doing about it, and most particularly I want to end about what we're trying to do to constrain state behavior, what we're doing in terms of a stability framework, and finally, some of the problems around attribution and deterrence. I was involved in cyber for about 27 years. I started first as a prosecutor in Los Angeles doing some of the early cybercrime cases. Kevin Mitnick I prosecuted. In fact, that had a connection to Finland because Nokia was one of the victims in that case. And so I dealt with Finnish authorities back then, and that was back in 1995, 1996. I moved from there to the mothership of justice and ran the computer crime section. I moved from there to the FBI. I moved from there to the White House in the beginning of the Obama administration and helped create some of the cyber policies there. And then finally, I moved to the State Department. So I want to talk about that perspective on all of these issues. And I also want to highlight this by some of the cases I want to talk about as I go through. And the other thing I hope you'll learn today is what this, zombies, have to do with this, a bunch of old-timey diplomats. And also why I'm so obsessed with this. And let me start there. My old office at the State Department, I tried to make it unique for a government office. So, most of the department offices had all these little knickknacks of everywhere where people had been, different countries, things like that. I had movie posters. I had movie posters where hackers or computers were the main characters. So I had about 30 of them, but this was my favorite. This movie is from 1970. It's the first movie where computers took over the world. The US builds Colossus to control its nuclear arsenal, take the man out of the middle, and have perfect deterrence. The Soviets, because it was the Soviets back then, stole the information, and they built their own version called Guardian in the Urals. And the two computers started talking to each other, became self-aware, and to protect humankind from themselves, they took away all civil liberties and took all over the world. And so that was an early cyber movie, and there are many others. Certainly, War Games, The Matrix, and others, but this really, I think, was an interesting movie that is still worth watching today. And it also, I think, typifies the way people think about cyberspace. They see the promise of it, but they're also fearful for a lot of the threats that are going on. They're fearful as we move into this age of artificial intelligence, et cetera, what that will mean, and particularly around offensive and other cyber operations. My first computer was this, an Atari 800 with a cassette tape drive, so we've come far from that time. Obviously, we all carry, and all of you carry, powerful computers in your pockets and have for some time. And we've all become very dependent, of course, on the internet for everything, and computer networks for everything, which wasn't always true. It's hard to believe it wasn't always true looking back. But at the same time, we've also been acutely aware, or many of us have become acutely aware, of the many threats we're facing in cyberspace. And I want to just talk about those threats. I'm sure many people at this conference have been regaling you with some of the more current threats. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's useful to break these threats down into two different categories. One are the technical threats we're facing, and we certainly have seen lots of those, and the other the policy threats. So the technical threats, our Director of National Intelligence for several years now has put out a threat report. General threat report, everything from counterterrorism to chem-bio to nuclear to cyber. And cyber is ranked as one of the top threats for the last number of years. And in that threat report, the public version of that threat report, they list a range of threat actors, everything from organized transnational criminal groups to ordinary criminals to nation states. And the top 4 nation states for a number of years now have been Russia and China at the top, more sophisticated, more full-spectrum actors, followed by North Korea and Iran, who are both developing their capabilities and becoming better. But there's other threats out there too. So that's part of the complex challenges that we're facing. And then, the way these threats have evolved, because we read about these challenges and these threats and some of these successful operations every day, and that sometimes it affects us personally, like the intrusion of the Office of Personnel Management that took a lot of the clearance data from many people. But I've seen that evolve substantially since I've been involved in this. So, for instance, I talked about prosecuting the Kevin Mitnick case. That was a case where he caused a significant amount of damage. He stole information from companies around the world, so many that when he pled guilty, because he pled guilty before going to trial, we had in the plea agreement multiple pages of victims, some only designated by letters, like victim AA, victim BB. But one of the victims, as I said, was here, and that victim actually was helpful in leading to his capture. But he claimed he wasn't trying to make a profit off this. He was breaking into all these companies. He was stealing in-development source code, including from Nokia and others. That certainly had a damaging effect on these companies, whatever his motive was. But people, I don't think, really understood why that was a big deal. People weren't so dependent on the internet then to understand it. And indeed, there was a group of people who thought he should be freed. There was a free Kevin banner flying over the courthouse when we were being sentenced. So there was this kind of disconnect between people understanding how important the technology was and what these actions really meant. Now, I mentioned Nokia. Nokia, I think, was important because Kevin Mitnick was really good as a social engineer, breaking into various systems simply by being a con man. He tried that with Nokia. Nokia recognized something was up, so they taped the conversation. And he said he couldn't get into their computer system using social engineering, so he asked them to send a copy of their in-development software on tape to him in a hotel. And we almost caught him there. We had a sting operation set up. It was in Los Angeles. And we had the thing at the counter. If he came and picked it up, we would have arrested him. He was a fugitive for 2.5 years at this point. But unfortunately, the LA police did a drug bust outside, and that spooked him. He ran away. So it was a bad neighborhood of LA, so that was unfortunate. But we worked very closely with Nokia, and that piece of evidence, I think, was really important because when you're trying to prove a case in court and you're going through all the different data and the forensics, it's sometimes hard for a jury to understand it. When you hear someone's voice on a tape pretending to be someone else, that's more, that means a lot more, and I think that was one of the things that really made a difference there. Another case I worked on was one of the first internet stock manipulation cases on the internet. A company called Paragon, a fake Bloomberg page was created. The stock went up 30% in the space of just a couple of hours, claiming that an Israeli company was going to buy this company, which was false. The web page was false, but people didn't know that. And it was interesting because there was a profit motive there, and we were able to trace that down in really just a week. And then we've had a flurry of cases, including ransomware cases recently, like the NotPetya case, the WannaCry case, very destructive computer worms and viruses. And we see that really accelerating. So as we get more dependent, we see these threats increase. And then, obviously, there have been other threats we've been looking at, like the wholesale theft of intellectual property by China. This is something that I'll talk about in a moment in terms of some of the diplomacy. The fear of integrity of information. So, one of my favorite people, Thomas Ilves, who was the former president of Estonia, used to say, look, if there's a denial of service attack and I can't reach my web page, I'm not happy about that. If someone breaks into my hospital and changes my blood type so that when I get a transfusion and I die, I'm really unhappy about that. And so integrity of information is, I think, one thing that's really important, but we really haven't spent as much time focusing on that. And then we're also continuing to be afraid of debilitating attacks on infrastructure, like the electrical power grid, the financial infrastructure. We haven't really seen that. We've been worried about that for a number of years. We have seen some tests of that. The Ukraine is an example. The taking down of the power grid in the Ukraine is a really good example of that. And we do think that that's something that we'll see more in the future. And then, and then there's new technologies like the Internet of Things. I think you guys remember the case. There was certainly the Mirai bot. But before that, there were a number of connected refrigerators that were used to launch an attack on financial institution websites, which I thought was a new way of freezing your assets. But you see these new technologies develop, and you see both the nation states and the criminals take advantage of these new technologies. It's sort of a cat and mouse game, and it's an interesting challenge. And then finally, there are the threats that I think we weren't really prepared to focus on. The cyber people in the government, when I was in the U.S. government, were focused on these more traditional threats, theft of information, attacks, but we really weren't focused on the kind of hybrid threat that Russian interference in our election posed. The cyber people understood cyber. The people who did influence operations understood influence operations, but we didn't really come together enough as a community to understand that that was a top threat until it happened. And I think now, obviously, we're really focused on it. Then we're also faced with a number of policy threats. We're also faced with a number of policy threats. So the technical threats are the attacks. The policy threats are countries who have a very different version and vision of what the internet's going to look like in the future. So particularly China and Russia, but other countries as well, view the free flow of information over the internet as a threat to stability. They view information itself as a weapon, and they've used it that way as well. And they even use the term information security versus cybersecurity because they're so concerned about that. And they've taken this approach of saying there should be absolute sovereignty on the internet. You should be able to control everything within your space on the internet. And that has lots of implications, including for the free flow of information. And certainly you've seen this with China and increasingly Russia as well. And that has the potential to fragment the internet in ways that I think will have huge economic costs, but also national security costs. I was recently, about a year ago, in Beijing, and this is actually something that was in my hotel room. It was the Hyatt. And it's this really nice thing. It looks at all it has all the different services. It has their actual logos. It looks really nice. But if you read the small print, it says, in accordance with the regulations in China, the following websites are not accessible, including but not limited to the following. So you think this is this great thing, you're going to get all these things. And they kept their trademarks, but it's not available. And we're seeing more of that going on, particularly, again, because they're worried about the destabilizing effect. And one of the problems with that is it's not just these countries. They are also trying to influence developing countries around the world who are in the middle and really are caught in this battle of which model to follow, the Western model or the Chinese and Russian and more repressive model. And then you have virtually every international body in the world debating some aspect of cyberspace. And that itself is a challenge because a lot of the decisions that are being made, whether they be standards or policy, are things that will have a significant impact on what the internet looks like in the future. And then you have virtually every country who can, and the estimates vary from over 50, over 100, whatever it is, countries who are developing cyber offensive capabilities. And it's being seen as a new domain of war, both in terms of developing those capabilities actually for defensive purposes, but also for offensive purposes. So I've often said that you see all this activity and you see all this talk about cyber. In some ways, cyber is a new black. Everyone's talking about it. No one's really knowing what to do about it. And then the question is, how do you address all these threats? And I want to talk a little bit about that. Again, more focused on the international aspects. One observation I've seen over the entire time I've been doing this is that, on a good note, the issue of cybersecurity and cyber has transitioned from being mostly what I call a niche issue, an issue where people really didn't understand it. If you went into a CEO of a company, if you went into a minister or a cabinet secretary in the US and talked about this, their eyes would roll back in the back of their heads and they'd say, you technical people take care of this. To where it's beginning to be understood more of a core issue of national security, a core issue of economic security, a core issue of human rights, and ultimately a core issue of foreign policy as well. And that really makes a difference because as important as the technical aspects are, if you don't elevate this issue to a higher policy plane, you're not going to really be able to deal with a lot of the solutions, particularly when you have nation-state actors who are in the game. And so I've seen that's been significant, but at the same time, that transition is still happening. So it'd be great if that's really the way we treated it, but too often when it comes down to decision times on these issues, it still is being treated a little bit as a bright, shiny object, a little bit too much as a boutique issue. In terms of what's being done generally, there was a lot of work done in the Obama administration. Obama's campaign was hacked into when he was campaigning. And so when he came into office, he was very serious about this. He created the Cyberspace Policy Review. He did a lot of work around incident response plans, focused on the issue more than anyone had before. And President Bush had focused on it to some before him. And that was significant. I thought that was a really good building block. And one of the things that he did is we did an international strategy for cyberspace, the first one that any country done. And my job was created at the State Department. So I moved from the White House over to the State Department. I was the first cyber diplomat. And it was a whole range of issues, everything from security issues, crime issues, issues around international stability and preventing cyber warfare, human rights issues like internet freedom, internet governance issues, how the internet is actually run. The range of issues, because these are too often stovepipe issues. The economic and the national security issues are too often stovepiped, and try to bring them all together in a more cohesive way. My office was the first one in the world that did that. But very quickly, we grew to having now about 30 counterparts around the world, including Finland. Finland has a very strong cyber ambassador, which is great. Many other countries are adding them. Australia added one last year. And it's an important trend because it supplements the technical and law enforcement cooperation to really have this higher policy level coordination as well. There's a lot of things that those diplomats do, a lot of things that really make a difference. Obviously, they talk to each other and they have dialogues, and that's great. But there's also operational coordination. So, for instance, pushing better coordination in response to cybercrime. There's something called the Budapest Convention for Cybercrime. That is the convention that the US and Finland and others thinks is really important, and we've been trying to promote that around the world, getting better cybercrime laws, getting better cooperation among law enforcement authorities to go after these cases, which are always transnational. Better coordination and actually the establishments of computer security emergency response teams around the world. That's been very important. Some of the capacity building work has been done by the US and other countries around the world has been trying to build those institutions and also strategies in this area. But also using diplomatic tools to combat threats. And this is one example I wanted to give you. There was I said in the beginning, what did those old-timey diplomats have to do with zombies? There was back a few years ago, there was what's called a distributed denial of service attack case. So botnets, compromised computers, tens of thousands of them, sometimes hundreds of thousands of them, all over the world, who are used to launch attacks on websites and make them unavailable. That's one thing you can do with a botnet. And the Iranians were using this. It wasn't public, it was the Iranians at that time, but they were indicted later. The Iranians were doing this to attack financial institutional websites in the US. And this is over a protracted period of time, over a year-long period. And it wasn't like the end of the world. They didn't get into the trading rooms of these institutions, but they actually made it more difficult for people to reach them. It had an impact on their business, and this was important. And we looked at various tools we could do to go after this, and one of the things we did is we did what's called a diplomatic démarche. We went to I called 20 of my counterparts around the world and said where these botnets were. And botnets, as you may know, they can change from day to day, and they can be in different countries all over the world. But we called a number of those countries where those concentrations were high, and we asked them to help us. Do what you can, using your laws, using your relationship to the ISPs and others, to actually help take those botnets down. And that was very effective, and that was trying to use this new diplomatic tool in conjunction with the technical and law enforcement tools we had together. Of course, another thing we did was negotiation. And I mentioned the Chinese theft of intellectual property, the rampant Chinese theft of intellectual property. And that was a real concern. And for over a year-and-a-half period, President Obama made clear that this is a big issue, not just a cyber issue, but an issue that affected national security and economic security. It really went to the core of our relationship, and we were willing to take friction in the overall relationship. And as a result of that, and also the result of a threat of sanctions or perceived threat of sanctions, the Chinese came to the table shortly before President Xi came to DC for a summit, and they agreed, which they never had before, that there was a difference between intelligence gathering, which every country does, and theft of intellectual property and trade secrets to benefit your commercial sector, which was important because I wasn't born yesterday. I don't expect the Chinese to live up to all the things they agreed to, but it creates a level of accountability, and there was a very strong drop in that activity after that agreement was reached. Now, I think several people, including one of the speakers earlier today, have looked at studies that indicate that that is much more on the rise now, and that also has to do with geopolitical relationships between the countries. But I think those are kind of significant things to reach those agreements to get that level of accountability. And the third thing, the thing I wanted to focus on more today was trying to shape the international environment for the long run. So we try to blunt cyber threats by hardening the targets, great, better hygiene, better cybersecurity, by law enforcement action, by technical actions, those are all important. But if we're trying to create an environment in the long term that is more stable in cyberspace, how do we do that? And one of the things we've done is we have spent a lot of time trying to develop a stability framework for cyberspace. International law applies, just like it does in the physical world. Cyber is not so different that you'd have a total different law regime for it. In fact, it would be dangerous if you did. That there's things that international law don't deal with that are below that threshold that we see every day, the everyday cyber incidents. So we've been developing what are called voluntary rules of the road. Peacetime norms is what we've been calling them, of state behavior. And then finally, confidence building measures. So, not this kind of norm or these norms, but norms like this. And this was an agreement which took place, or some of these were the agreement that took place in the UN and a group of what's called governmental experts. It included Russia and China, interestingly, and the US and the UK and others. And they were able to agree on a number of norms. Now, one was the IP norm I talked about earlier, that you shouldn't steal intellectual property to benefit your commercial sector. That one was in a different venue, but that was agreed to in the G20, and so that was important. The ones that were agreed in this GG and then affirmed later at the UN level was that a state should not conduct or knowingly support online activity that essentially attacks or impairs the critical infrastructure of another state, absent wartime. Wartime, there are different rules. There's things like proportionality and distinction. But in peacetime, you shouldn't be attacking the critical infrastructure of another country. Now, we see this happening still, but it's important to get that level of accountability. Another one is that a norm of cooperation. The state should cooperate. If you see malicious code coming from a country, another state asks you to help, you should be able to help using technical or law enforcement means. Another important one is that you shouldn't attack the computer security incident response teams of another country. They're like the ambulances. They're like the hospitals. You shouldn't go after them as destabilizing to do that. And you shouldn't use them for offensive purposes. You should use them for defensive purposes. Now, those are all, and there were a number of other ones that were agreed to, too. Those are really good movements to create this larger stability in cyberspace. Again, the question is, do you actually live up to these norms? But getting them to agree is important. This commission I'm on, the Commission for the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, has been looking at other proposed norms. And the couple that we've looked at and agreed to is that states should not go after the public core of the internet. They can certainly do things that are more law enforcement oriented or frankly even intelligence oriented, but you shouldn't do something that takes down the internet for everyone. You should be careful about the routing, the domain name system, et cetera. And another one, which is very timely, that no country or non-state actor should go after really the infrastructure that is used for elections. Now, this is different than influence operations, but it's actually going to the voting databases, trying to affect the machines. So it's important to have that normative framework, and that's been a real, as I said, focus of a lot of these efforts, is to create this normative framework and then supplementing it with something called confidence building measures. And these are like very much, this is the only place, in my view, that cyberspace and the nuclear world converge, because we did these confidence building measures in the nuclear world, exchanging doctrine, having hotlines, having points of contact. The idea is practically to de-escalate or to try not to escalate a situation because you have these communications and other channels. And so that's been the third leg of the stool, international law norms, voluntary norms, and confidence building measures we've been pursuing. And I think that's been successful in trying to build that framework. There have been bumps along the road, and I think especially with Russia, to some extent China, becoming Russia more disruptive, China more willing to go on their own way. There's been some issues of whether we can continue down this road of getting these kind of agreements. But I think it's been important. But the biggest problem I see now, and the biggest problem I think not just for US policy, but for policy around the world, is it's great to have these norms. It's great to come up with all these things the state shouldn't do, right? But if they do it anyway, and there's no consequences for them doing it, they're little more than just words on paper. You really need to have the costs that are imposed on bad actors, just like in a criminal case. If you don't, you can lock the doors, you can harden the targets, but if there's no consequences for the people who break in, you're essentially creating an environment where you're saying that's okay, and they're going to come back and they're going to come harder. And that's true with states, too. If there's no consequences for them, and they're getting some benefit out of it, why wouldn't they do it again? So, for instance, in the election interference in the US, I think you can strongly argue that there's not really been effective consequences. There have been some sanctions, to be sure. There have been some other activity. But part of imposing costs also is consistent messaging. So it is true that during the Trump administration, there was an executive order that talked about the importance of cyber. That's great. There was a strategy that came out recently, which I also think is very important because it builds off prior strategies. It doesn't pretend to reinvent the world, and that's actually a good thing. There's some good aspects of that strategy, which I'll talk about in a second. But one of the things that's unclear is you have a lot of good activity at the lower level, but you don't have the consistent messaging you need from the top. So the example is President Trump undercutting the Russia issue every time by saying he's not sure they did it. And you could do all the great deterrence in the world, you could impose all the costs you want to, but if you're undercutting that with that high-level messaging, that's really difficult. Another example, but at the same time, there's been some real efforts to do something, to impose costs. What they've done so far more is really do this kind of joint attribution, and that's different too. States have not traditionally wanted to attribute conduct to another state in cyberspace. That changed back during the Obama administration when Obama came out and said North Korea was responsible for the Sony picture attack. That was a major, important thing. It was funny because it indicated one of the problems with attribution. Attribution is possible in cyberspace. It's not impossible. I think it's a myth that is impossible. It's not just following the digital footprints. But before Obama came out and said it was North Korea, everyone said it was North Korea. When he came out and said it was North Korea, a lot of people in the community said, oh, it's not North Korea, he's wrong. Because we didn't release all the evidence we had, and we're not going to release. No state's going to release all the sensitive information they have in every case. So you have to build up this trust. You have to build up this cadence where people understand why you're doing it and how you're doing it. And it's better if you do that together than if you do it alone. What I think the real positive development I've seen recently is we still haven't been good at imposing costs, but we've been far better at calling out bad state actions. So last week was, I think, a great example. What happened in Holland with the Russian operatives there, where I think now it's up to 30 countries who have condemned, who agreed and come together and saying that Russia was responsible for this, a very strong case that the UK, the US, and the Dutch authorities made. That's really significant. Recently, also the NotPetya worm, the US, Australia, others attributed that to Russia, and the WannaCry worm attributed to North Korea. Again, I think that's really a positive step, but you're not going to name and shame Russia or North Korea. You can call them out, and it will have some effect on them, but you're not going to really name and shame them. So what are you going to do? What is the actions you're going to take that's actually going to change your behavior? And you have to think about targeted costs. What states can do is they can do diplomatic costs, which have some effect sometimes. You can indict people, but if they're state actors, probably not going to have a major effect. You could do economic sanctions. I think we need to do that in a more targeted way. You could use cyber tools, which I think that's an important thing to have in your arsenal, but I think those are well overpromised and underdelivered. I think people all think there's a magic cyber button you hit and that your countries can do cyber things to each other. It's just not there. And I think we have to be careful to integrate those into the normal things. When John Bolton rolled out the national strategy that the U.S. just came out, he talked about the U.S. is going to be using offensive tools more. He did something I call cyber rattling. It's like saber rattling, only with cyber. And he was really strong about this. And the problem with that is, yes, those tools are important, but we really don't understand what the escalation paths are on those tools, how they get used, whether that's going to be more harmful to us in the long run, and whether those are the most effective tools for the job. So, if you're trying to build partnerships with other countries and you're taking unilateral actions, those things are in opposition to each other. So we have to look at both. So we have this limited tool set, and we need to think about what other tools are there and what other things we can pursue. And I think that's a real challenge going forward, is how we build coalitions of countries who can act together against these shared threats. And I think that there's been, again, some good work. One of the good things about this new national strategy is this idea of an international deterrence initiative that the US put out. And this has really been happening for some time. And it's to get like-minded countries together to actually impose costs together, something like the Non-Proliferation Initiative. Groups of countries, informally, depending on what the circumstance is and what the action is, and taking some action that's actually going to have an effect in deterring these actors in the long run. And so far, we've done a lousy job of that. We're now moving to, I hope, doing a better job. The attribution, for instance, in NotPetya, when they said it was Russia, they did that 6.5 months after the event happened. If you want to have good deterrence, you want timely and credible response. Timely, 6.5 months later, and then saying, and a response is coming, and it's not here yet. It's probably not that effective, but it is a building block. So I think we need to be much better at that. And I do worry if we don't do that. And we have to do everything else too, right? We have to have good resilience strategies. We have to have national strategies that build capacity around the world. We have to make sure we're working with the business community and civil society. In fact, we should be working with the business community to think about, are there tools in our tool set we haven't thought of? I mean, other than these standard tools we use for deterrence, are there other things we should be doing? So we have to look at all those different aspects as we go forward. Because otherwise, if we don't, we're going to have that chaotic environment that was my first slide, the Colossus. And this slide, if anyone's been to Bletchley Park, where they broke the Enigma code and the Lorenz code during World War II, the Nazi Enigma code, this is a rebuilt version of the real Colossus. Colossus was the first digital computer. No one knew about it until the 80s or the late 70s because the Brits kept this under wraps after World War II. So this was really the first computer, and it wasn't used to destroy the world or take over the world. It was used really to help end World War II and break the high-level Lorenz code that was used by the Nazi high command and by Hitler himself. And that is the positive use of the technology. And I think as we use diplomacy, but also these other tools, it all has to be in service to the economic and social benefit we're going to get from the internet, recognizing the threats are so big out there, we're going to have to take action that actually punishes it and has an effect. So if we want to avoid this future, another movie poster, and have instead this poster, which has nothing to do with movies, about computers, I mean, then I think we have to come together. We have to work together as a community, but we also have to work together as an international community to go after these threats and go after them in a much better way than we have so far. So with that, what I wanted to do is not just be to talk at you, but also have time for questions and answers. So I wanted to open up the questions and answers for the next 10 minutes or so.
But let's give him a very big hand for that very compelling presentation. Thank you ever so much. Questions, comments, a lot of stuff there on diplomacy, deterrence, technology, regulation. Anybody want to get us started on those?
Don't be shy.
I'll start, and then you can think about a question since we do have time. You were as a prosecutor, and then you went into government, and now you have left government, and now into the wild of.
I've left the tepid embrace of the federal government.
That's right. But moving into perhaps the private sector and seeing the world now from the outside of that, how do we really beef up together our diplomacy and deterrence capability? It seems that we have huge holes in both. And what's the road ahead?
So I think we have to be concrete. I mean, one of the things that used to drive me nuts when I was in the government, and I know drives a lot of private sector people nuts too, is that people would throw around this term public-private partnership, like as a talismanic term. It didn't have any substance to it. It was like, oh, we need a public-private partnership. Yes, we do, absolutely. But you need to put concrete terms around that. What do we need a public-private partnership for? How are we going to share information between the public and private sector? What's the information we're going to share that's actually be actionable on each side? And then on the deterrence side, look, you can't ask the private sector to be the deterrence agents, but they can actually think about some tools the government could use. I mean, people have thrown around ideas like, if you have a nation state that's acting against you, do you black hole traffic? Do you do things like that? But I think we need to be more creative and actually have these discussions that go beyond just the sharing of information, which is critically
these
important.
These cyber
too.
buttons we need to invent.
The cyber buttons. Right.
Yeah. Good. Yes, we have a question here. Could you please bring him his microphone. Tell us who you are and your question, please. Thank you.
Thanks. I am Tommi Rasila. I represent a company called Jetico, and we make encryption, for instance.
Yeah.
We are a member of FISC, Finnish Information Security Cluster. Juha is the CEO of that. And in Finland and among FISC, we're very proud of being able to do pure cyber, pure security without backdoors, and like we say in our slogan, no strings attached. Because we believe, like actually Risto Siilasmaa told here earlier today, that if there is a backdoor for somebody, there basically will be a backdoor for everybody after that. So in here, we sort of fight for the sovereignty of information security, but at the same time we do know that there's pressure to change that. There's pressure in US to open up, and there are backdoors. How do you actually? What are your, or do you have arguments?
Look,
pro?
I think this is a really hard issue, and I, coming from the law enforcement community, obviously, I mean, originally. Obviously, you want to be able to catch criminals and terrorists, and if they're using strong encryption, that creates problems. And this has been true for years, right? At the same time, I totally agree with you. If you create vulnerable products, you're hurting cybersecurity. You're also hurting privacy. This is not this is a problem because they really are in opposition to each other. And there's a difference, as you know, between device encryption on the device like a phone or something, and encryption in transit. And we have to deal with both of those problems. So I don't think there's an easy solution to that. I do think there needs to be more work between the government and the private sector, companies, and see if we can come up with solutions that are not backdoors. I think backdoors are sort of pejorative issues and do cause a lot of problems, but ways that we can actually attack this issue that still will lead to a trusted environment. And the solutions I've seen are so complicated they're not workable. So I think we really need to dig down and think of how we do this.
Thank you. More questions, comments on this? I'd like to take you back to what you said about imposing costs and how poorly we've done with this in terms of being innovative in terms of the technical side, working with the private sector in this so-called public-private partnership, but also in terms of diplomatic deterrence and strategy. It seems that what we're doing so far, has not abated Russia, China in doing what they're doing. What is the future of a diplomacy that actually works with?
Right. Look, there are some that argue that you're not going to be able to deter Russia and China, or that you can't do deterrence in cyberspace. I'm not that pessimistic. I think you can deter nation states. I think every nation state is different. What matters to China is different than matters to Russia. China cares about its effect on soft power. If you name and shame China, they care about that. Russia doesn't care that much, although you could argue that the recent events with Russia last week will hurt them in terms of some of the things they're trying to do in the UN. They're trying to pass a new cybercrime treaty. They're trying to introduce other things that are things that the Western countries oppose. So maybe it will hurt them a little bit with their standing, and maybe they'll have an effect. But then you have to think of what's going to make a difference to Russia, and particularly to Putin. What's going to change his mind? And I think you have to do that for each of the adversaries you're dealing with. So I think that's a challenge going forward. It's not just diplomatic. It's actually thinking about through what those strategic plans are for each of these different adversaries and when you have to use them. And the other thing I'd say is we have to be much more transparent about how we do this. We have to communicate both to everyone and to our adversaries we're going to do certain things, and that will actually, hopefully, change your behavior.
Let's hope indeed.
Well, I'll close, since I think we're out of time now.
Yes.
I'll just close with a final joke. So it's another
a lawyer joke.
It's another lawyer joke, but it's converted to being a hacker joke. So a lawyer, this was a lawyer, but it's a hacker is walking down the beach. He finds a lamp, he rubs it, and predictably enough, a genie comes out. And the genie says, "Look, you get 3 wishes, but because you're a hacker, there's some strings attached. Everything you wish for, every other hacker gets twice as much of." And the hacker says, "Okay, I can deal with that." Well, I want, he says, "What's your first wish?" And the hacker says, "I want a million Bitcoin." So he gets 1 million Bitcoin, but every other hacker gets 2 million Bitcoin. And that kind of really, hackers are competitive people. This really kind of bothers him. And he goes, "Well, what's your second wish?" And he goes, "Well, I want a giant supercomputer, a crazy supercomputer." So every hacker gets, he gets that, but every other hacker gets that, plus Watson, the computer that, the IBM computer that won on Jeopardy. And again, he's really upset about this. And the genie says, hurry up, what's your third wish? I need to get back in the bottle and watch I Dream of Jeannie reruns. What do you want? And the hacker pauses and he thinks about it and says, I'd like to donate a kidney. So every other hacker donates 2 kidneys, they all die. So the moral of that joke is just that, I've seen in the course of my career the attacks that we've seen, both by criminals and nation states, have gotten ever more sophisticated. And there really is, I think, a real imperative that we have a dedicated, high-level approach in countries, but also with other stakeholders, including the private sector, to deal with this. Otherwise, all the benefits we're getting are going to be jeopardized.
Thank you for that insight. Thank you very much. Give him a very, very big hand. Thank you, Christofer.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.